The courtroom was tense, filled with reporters, attorneys, and spectators waiting for the trial to begin. Emily Carter sat at the witness stand, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, knowing that every word she spoke today would determine the fate of the man sitting just a few feet away. Then, from the defense table, a low chuckle broke the silence. She turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Officer Brian Randall, who sat back in his chair, smirking as if this entire trial was nothing more than a joke. He leaned forward, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. "You really think they're gonna believe you over me?" Emily didn't flinch. She looked him straight in the eye, her pulse steady, and replied, "They don't have to believe me. The truth will speak for itself." The judge's gavel struck, and the trial began. Emily Carter sat in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the edge of the wooden chair as she waited for her name to be called. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs, the kind that always filled a courtroom before a high-profile case. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the silent judgment, the curiosity, the doubt. It wasn't the first time she had felt it, but today it felt heavier than ever. She was here to testify against Officer Brian Randall, a man who had spent years patrolling the city with a badge that granted him more power than he deserved. She had seen what he had done with that power. She had witnessed firsthand the way he manipulated situations, how he twisted the law to serve himself rather than the people he had sworn to protect. But knowing the truth and proving it were two entirely different things. The courtroom was packed, reporters in the back, a few activists who had been following the case closely, and a handful of off-duty officers who had come to support Randall. Emily knew that most of them weren't here to hear her side of the story. They had already made up their minds. To them, Randall was a respected officer, someone who had served the community for years, and she was nothing more than a civilian who didn't understand the realities of police work. The door to the judge's chambers opened, and the bailiff stepped forward. "All rise," he announced, his voice carrying through the room with practiced authority. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Foster presiding. The room stood as Judge Foster took her seat. She was an older woman with sharp eyes that had seen too many cases like this before. She glanced at the files in front of her, flipping through the pages, then looked up at the prosecution. "Are we ready to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor said, standing. "Call your first witness." The prosecutor turned toward Emily and gave her a reassuring nod. "The state calls Emily Carter to the stand." Emily forced herself to stand, her legs steady despite the tension coiling in her stomach. She walked toward the witness stand, feeling every step, hearing every shuffle and whisper from the audience. She kept her chin up, refusing to let them see her hesitation. She took her seat, placing a hand on the worn wooden surface of the stand as the bailiff approached her with the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," she said, her voice firm despite the knot in her throat. The prosecutor stepped forward, his expression calm but focused. "Miss Carter, can you please state your name and occupation for the record?" She cleared her throat. "Emily Carter. I work as a paramedic for the city." The prosecutor nodded. "And can you tell the court why you're here today?" Emily glanced briefly at Randall, who was seated at the defense table, relaxed, his arms folded, a smirk barely concealed on his lips. He wasn't worried. She turned back to the prosecutor. "I'm here to tell the truth about what happened the night of June 14th, she said, her voice steady. "I'm here because I saw what Officer Randall did, and I know it was wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling in. But from the defense table, she heard it, soft at first, then more pronounced. A chuckle. She turned her head slightly and saw Randall shaking his head, his smirk widening. Emily's hands clenched into fists beneath the stand. She had expected hostility. She had expected doubt. But she hadn't expected him to laugh. Emily's jaw tightened as she heard the quiet, mocking chuckle coming from the defense table. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see Officer Brian Randall sitting back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk widening as if this entire trial was nothing more than an inconvenience to him. His confidence was infuriating, but not surprising. He had spent years getting away with his actions, protected by his badge, by the system, by the people who refused to believe that someone like him could be guilty. The prosecutor cleared his throat, drawing Emily's attention back to him. "Miss Carter, let's start with the events leading up to June 14th. Can you describe what you were doing that night?" She forced herself to focus, pushing aside the irritation bubbling inside her. "I was working my shift as a paramedic. It was around midnight when we received a call about a disturbance in a residential neighborhood. The dispatcher said that law enforcement was already on the scene but that medical assistance was required." The prosecutor nodded. "And when you arrived, what did you see?" Emily took a steadying breath, recalling the moment with perfect clarity. "When we pulled up, we saw Officer Randall and two other officers standing over a man on the ground. He was handcuffed, face down on the pavement. There was blood pooling beneath his head." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Randall shifted slightly in his seat but still looked unconcerned. The prosecutor gestured for her to continue. "Did you recognize the man on the ground?" "Yes," Emily said. "His name was Marcus Hall. He was unarmed." "And how did he appear when you saw him?" Emily glanced at Randall again, his expression unreadable now, but she could still feel the amusement in his posture and the way he refused to take this seriously. "He was barely conscious," she said, her voice unwavering. "His breathing was shallow. He had severe bruising on his ribs and face. When I tried to assess him, Officer Randall told me to step back." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "He told you not to provide medical assistance?" "Yes," Emily confirmed. "I told him that the man needed immediate medical attention, but he said that I wasn't needed yet. He said, 'He's fine. He's just playing it up.'" Another murmur ran through the courtroom. Randall scoffed loudly from his seat. "Oh, come on," he muttered, shaking his head. The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing the room. "Officer Randall, you will not speak out of turn in my courtroom. Do I make myself clear?" Randall shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Crystal, Your Honor." Emily felt anger rise in her chest. He wasn't even trying to hide his contempt for the proceedings. He truly believed this trial was just a formality, that nothing would come of it, that he would walk out of here the same way he always had, untouched. The prosecutor took a step closer to the witness stand. "Miss Carter, did you comply with Officer Randall's instruction?" "No," Emily said firmly. "I ignored him and knelt down to check Marcus's pulse. That's when I realized his breathing was getting weaker. He needed oxygen immediately, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness." The prosecutor nodded. "What happened next?" Emily tightened her grip on the edge of the stand. "Officer Randall pulled me away." The room fell completely silent. The prosecutor's expression didn't change, but there was a tension in his voice when he asked, "He physically pulled you away from providing medical care?" Emily swallowed hard, remembering the way his grip had dug into her arm, the way his voice had been so casual, like he was doing her a favor by stopping her. "Yes," she said. "He grabbed my arm and told me to stand down because I was getting in the way." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Randall rolled his eyes. The prosecutor let the silence hang in the air for a few seconds before he spoke again. "Miss Carter, did Officer Randall give any justification for preventing you from treating Mr. Hall?" Emily clenched her jaw, feeling her pulse quicken. "He said it wasn't necessary. That Marcus wasn't in real danger. That he had seen 100 guys fake injuries to get sympathy." The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "And was Marcus Hall faking his injuries?" Emily's stomach twisted. She hated this part the most, reliving it, remembering how helpless she had felt in that moment. "No," she said, her voice quieter but still firm. "He died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital." The courtroom erupted into gasps and hushed whispers. For the first time since the trial started, Randall's smirk faltered. His posture stiffened slightly, though he quickly masked it with another dismissive shake of his head. Emily, however, wasn't done. She looked directly at Randall and, for the first time, saw something flicker in his expression: uncertainty. "You can laugh all you want," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "But that doesn't change the truth." The room went silent again, all eyes shifting between her and Randall. For the first time, the laughter had stopped. The weight of Emily's words settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the usual rustling of papers and shifting of seats had stopped. She had just said the one thing no one could ignore: Marcus Hall had died, and Officer Brian Randall had prevented her from helping him. Randall, who had spent the past hour smirking, rolling his eyes, and treating the entire trial as a joke, finally seemed to register the gravity of the situation. His grin had disappeared, replaced by something colder, something less sure. He sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the defense table as if he was suddenly aware that he no longer had complete control of the room. The prosecutor let the silence hang for a moment longer before clearing his throat and stepping closer to the witness stand. His voice was measured, calm, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Miss Carter, you stated that Marcus Hall died in the ambulance. Can you tell the court what the cause of death was?" Emily kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, forcing herself to stay composed. She had testified in difficult cases before: car accidents, violent crimes, overdose victims, but nothing had ever felt like this. She wasn't just recounting a tragedy. She was naming the person who had contributed to it. "He suffered severe internal bleeding," she said. "The injuries he sustained from excessive force caused organ damage, and by the time we were able to intervene, it was too late." The prosecutor nodded. "And in your professional opinion, if Mr. Hall had received immediate medical attention on the scene, would he have survived?" Randall shifted in his seat. Emily inhaled slowly. "Yes," she said. "If I had been able to treat him right away, his chances of survival would have been significantly higher." The murmurs in the courtroom returned, louder this time, more frantic. The prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, the prosecution would like to submit the official autopsy report into evidence." Randall's attorney shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation. Miss Carter is not a forensic pathologist." Judge Foster barely glanced at him as she responded. "The witness is a licensed paramedic with years of field experience. She is qualified to give her professional assessment." Objection overruled. The attorney sat down, looking irritated. Randall, however, was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched. The prosecutor turned back to Emily. "Miss Carter, I want to be clear about something. At any point, did Officer Randall attempt to administer aid to Mr. Hall himself?" Emily shook her head. "No." "Did he call for medical backup?" "No." The prosecutor's voice hardened. "So, to be absolutely clear, Officer Randall both denied you access to the victim and refused to provide medical assistance himself?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice firm. Randall let out a slow exhale through his nose, finally turning his head toward her, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't the look of a man who felt remorse. It was the look of a man who had just realized the walls were closing in. The prosecutor took a step back, allowing the weight of the testimony to sink in. Then, with the same measured tone, he asked, "Miss Carter, do you believe Officer Randall's actions contributed to the death of Marcus Hall?" Emily met Randall's gaze head-on. "Yes," she said. "I do." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, reporters scrambling to take notes, everyone reacting to the statement that had just sealed Randall's fate. The judge slammed her gavel. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." Slowly, the noise died down. The prosecutor turned back toward the jury, giving them a moment to absorb what they had just heard before speaking again. "No further questions, Your Honor." Emily exhaled, finally allowing herself to unclench her fists. But as she stepped down from the witness stand, she couldn't shake the feeling that this fight was far from over. Emily returned to her seat, feeling the weight of every step as she moved away from the witness stand. The courtroom was still tense, the air thick with unspoken reactions. She could hear the faint scribbling of pens on notepads from the reporters in the back, the occasional cough, the rustling of fabric as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But the only thing she focused on was the presence of Brian Randall just a few feet away. He hadn't said anything since she left the stand. He sat rigidly in his chair, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of the defense table. His smirk was gone, his jaw tight, his posture less relaxed than before. For the first time since this trial started, it looked like he was actually considering the possibility that things might not go his way. The defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie before turning to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would like to cross-examine the witness." Judge Foster gave a curt nod. "Proceed." Emily steeled herself as the attorney walked toward her, his expression carefully composed. She knew what was coming. This was the part where they tried to discredit her, twist her words, make her doubt herself. But she wouldn't let them. The attorney stopped in front of her, glancing at his notes before looking up. "Miss Carter, you stated that Officer Randall prevented you from administering medical assistance to Mr. Hall. Is that correct?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "And at the time, did Officer Randall physically harm you in any way?" Emily's brows furrowed slightly. "Excuse me?" The attorney tilted his head slightly, as if trying to sound reasonable. "Did he shove you? Did he strike you? Did he use force against you to stop you from providing care?" Emily exhaled slowly, already seeing the tactic he was using. "No," she admitted. "He didn't shove or strike me. But he grabbed my arm and told me to stand down." The attorney nodded as if he had expected this answer. "So, just to clarify, Officer Randall did not physically harm you in any way. He simply instructed you not to intervene." Emily felt frustration rise in her chest. "He didn't have to harm me for his actions to be wrong. He used his authority to stop me from saving a man's life. That's the issue here." The attorney kept his expression neutral. "And are you absolutely certain that, had you been able to intervene immediately, Mr. Hall would have survived?" Emily hesitated for half a second. Not because she doubted herself, but because she knew exactly how they wanted her to answer. They wanted uncertainty, something they could exploit. She met the attorney's gaze. "I can't guarantee he would have survived. But I can guarantee that his chances would have been much higher. And I can guarantee that Officer Randall never gave him that chance." A murmur ran through the courtroom again, and Emily saw the attorney's jaw tighten slightly. He took a step back, adjusting his suit jacket before speaking again. "Miss Carter, I have no further questions at this time." He turned and walked back to the defense table. Randall whispered something to him, his voice low and sharp, but the attorney simply shook his head. Judge Foster turned toward the prosecution. "Does the state have another witness to call?" The prosecutor stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Marcus Hall's mother, Teresa Hall, to the stand." The room fell into an even deeper silence. Emily watched as a woman in her mid-50s stood from the audience, her hands trembling slightly as she walked toward the witness stand. Her face was lined with grief, exhaustion visible in every movement. Teresa Hall sat down and took the oath, her voice barely above a whisper as she promised to tell the truth. The prosecutor approached her carefully. "Mrs. Hall, I know this is difficult for you, but can you tell the court a little bit about your son?" Teresa took a shaky breath. "Marcus was a good man. He worked hard. He took care of me when I got sick. He never wanted trouble. He just wanted to live his life." Her voice cracked on the last sentence, and Emily felt her chest tighten. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. "The night Marcus was arrested, did anyone from law enforcement contact you?" Teresa shook her head. "No one told me what happened until it was too late. I got a call from the hospital telling me my son was gone. The prosecutor let the silence linger before asking, "Mrs. Hall, if you had been told sooner, if you had been given a chance to be there, what would you have said to your son?" Teresa's lips trembled. She looked down for a moment, collecting herself, then looked directly at Randall. "I would have told him to hold on," she whispered. "I would have told him that I loved him. That he wasn't alone." The entire courtroom seemed to exhale at once, as if the weight of her grief had settled on all of them. Even Randall, for just a moment, looked away. Judge Foster's voice was soft but firm. "We will adjourn for today. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning." She banged the gavel, signaling the end of the day's session. Emily sat frozen as the room slowly emptied around her. She had spent so much time thinking about what she had seen that night, about the injustice of it all, about Randall's arrogance. But sitting here now, listening to a mother's grief, she realized something even more painful. Justice wouldn't bring Marcus Hall back. But maybe, just maybe, it could make sure this never happened to someone else's son. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with an even heavier tension than before. The previous day's testimony had left a mark on everyone present. Teresa Hall's words still echoed in Emily's mind, her grief tangible, her pain something that no one could ignore. Even the air inside the courtroom felt different, as though the weight of truth was finally pressing down on everyone, leaving no space for Randall's arrogance to breathe. Emily sat in her seat near the front, watching as Randall entered the courtroom. His usual smirk was gone. His movements were stiffer, his jaw clenched tightly as he took his place next to his lawyer. Maybe it was the reaction from the public, maybe it was the realization that this case wasn't going to disappear the way so many others had, but something had shifted in him. He was still trying to act unaffected, but for the first time since this trial began, he looked like a man who was beginning to understand that he might lose. The bailiff called for the room to rise as Judge Foster entered, taking her seat behind the bench. She adjusted her glasses, glancing down at the files in front of her before speaking. "This court is now back in session. Prosecution, you may proceed." The prosecutor stood and adjusted his tie before turning toward the jury. "Your Honor, the state would like to call its next witness to the stand, Officer Michael Diaz." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as a man in uniform stood from the audience and made his way to the witness stand. Unlike Randall, Officer Diaz carried himself with a rigid professionalism. His uniform was neatly pressed, his expression unreadable as he raised his right hand to take the oath. Once sworn in, the prosecutor approached. "Officer Diaz, can you please state your full name and rank for the record?" "Michael Diaz, Sergeant with the City Police Department," he said, his voice firm. The prosecutor nodded. "Sergeant Diaz, were you present on the night of June 14th? "Yes, I was," Diaz confirmed. "And can you describe what you witnessed that night?" Diaz inhaled slowly, his eyes flickering toward Randall before focusing back on the prosecutor. "I arrived on the scene shortly after Officer Randall and his team had already detained Marcus Hall. When I got there, Hall was on the ground, handcuffed, and bleeding from the head. He appeared to be in medical distress." The prosecutor's voice remained calm but precise. "Did Officer Randall or anyone on his team request immediate medical attention?" Diaz hesitated for only a second before answering. "No." The tension in the room tightened. The prosecutor nodded. "What did you do when you arrived?" "I assessed the situation and asked if an ambulance had been called," Diaz explained. "Officer Randall told me it wasn't necessary. He said Hall was faking it to avoid arrest." Emily clenched her fists in her lap. The prosecutor stepped closer. "And what was your response?" Diaz's expression hardened. "I told him we couldn't take that risk. I radioed for medical assistance myself." The prosecutor gave a slow nod. "So, just to clarify, despite Officer Randall's dismissal of Mr. Hall's condition, you took it upon yourself to call for medical help?" "Yes," Diaz said. "And in your professional opinion, was Marcus Hall in medical distress at the time of your arrival?" "Absolutely," Diaz said without hesitation. "It was obvious he needed help." The prosecutor turned slightly toward the jury. If Officer Randall had called for an ambulance sooner, would that have increased Mr. Hall's chances of survival? Diaz looked straight at Randall before answering. Yes, it would have. Another ripple of murmurs swept through the audience. The prosecutor stepped back slightly. One last question, Sergeant Diaz. Did Officer Randall ever express any concern for Mr. Hall's well-being that night? Diaz's jaw tightened before he shook his head. No, he didn't. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of Diaz's words sinking in. Thank you, Sergeant Diaz. No further questions. Randall's lawyer stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the witness stand. Sergeant Diaz, you've worked with Officer Randall for years, have you not? Yes, I have, Diaz said. And would you describe him as a competent officer? Diaz hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Randall again. I would describe him as experienced. The lawyer smirked slightly. That wasn't exactly the question, Sergeant. Would you say that Officer Randall has served the city well? Diaz shifted in his seat before answering. I would say that Officer Randall has served the city in his own way. Emily caught the subtle meaning behind those words, and by the looks exchanged in the jury box, they did too. The defense attorney sighed, rubbing his chin. Sergeant, I just have one more question. Isn't it true that officers often have to make split-second decisions in the field? Decisions that might not always look good in hindsight? Diaz nodded slowly. Yes. But letting a man bleed out on the pavement wasn't a split-second decision. It was a choice. The defense attorney's smirk faded. No further questions, he muttered before quickly returning to his seat. Judge Foster adjusted her glasses and turned toward the jury. We will adjourn for lunch and reconvene in 1 hour. She struck the gavel, signaling a break, and the room slowly began to empty. Emily sat still, her hands clasped together tightly. Randall had spent the entire trial acting like this was nothing, like he had nothing to lose. But now, with Diaz's testimony on record, something had changed. He wasn't laughing anymore. And for the first time since this trial began, Emily felt something close to hope. After the lunch break, the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface since the trial began was now thick, suffocating. The testimony from Sergeant Diaz had shaken the room. No longer was this a case of a civilian's word against a police officer's. Now, there was undeniable confirmation from within the department itself, confirmation that Officer Randall had deliberately chosen to deny medical assistance to Marcus Hall. Emily sat quietly in her seat, watching as Randall re-entered the courtroom. His posture was stiffer than before, his usual arrogance visibly chipped away. He didn't meet anyone's eyes, not his lawyers, not the judge's, and certainly not hers. As the judge took her seat and the bailiff called for order, the prosecutor stood once again. Your Honor, the state would like to call its final witness, Dr. Karen Blake, Chief Medical Examiner. A woman in her mid-40s, dressed in a dark blue suit, stood from the audience and made her way to the witness stand. She moved with the confidence of someone who had testified in cases like this before, someone who had seen the worst of humanity and had long since stopped being rattled by it. After she was sworn in, the prosecutor approached her with a calm but direct demeanor. Dr. Blake, can you please state your full name and profession for the record? Dr. Karen Blake. I am the Chief Medical Examiner for this county. Dr. Blake, did you perform the autopsy on Marcus Hall? Yes, I did. The prosecutor nodded. Can you summarize your findings for the court? Dr. Blake adjusted the microphone slightly before speaking. Marcus Hall suffered multiple contusions and fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. His ribs were broken, his skull had sustained an impact wound, and his lungs showed signs of distress due to delayed medical intervention. The cause of death was internal bleeding due to prolonged trauma. The room was completely silent. No one even shifted in their seats. The prosecutor stepped closer. In your expert opinion, if Mr. Hall had received medical assistance immediately, could he have survived? Dr. Blake sighed, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that only came from seeing too many preventable deaths. There's never a guarantee in cases like these, but based on my findings, I believe that if medical personnel had been allowed to treat him without delay, his chances of survival would have been significantly higher. The prosecutor let the weight of her words settle before continuing. Dr. Blake, in your experience, have you seen cases where delay in medical treatment directly contributed to a person's death? Yes, she answered without hesitation. And this is one of those cases. The prosecutor turned slightly toward the jury. So to clarify, the injuries Mr. Hall sustained were survivable had he received help in time? Yes, she said. The bleeding could have been controlled, and his chances of recovery would have been good. Emily felt a sharp pang in her chest. She already knew this, she had known it the moment she knelt beside Marcus Hall that night. But hearing it confirmed so plainly, so clinically, made it even more real. The prosecutor nodded, stepping back slightly. No further questions, Your Honor. Randall's attorney stood, adjusting his tie before approaching the witness stand. Dr. Blake, you've testified that Mr. Hall's injuries were serious, correct? Yes, she said. But you cannot say with absolute certainty that even with immediate medical attention, he would have survived? Dr. Blake's gaze didn't waver. No medical professional can give absolute certainty in trauma cases, but the delay undeniably worsened his condition. The attorney sighed, shaking his head slightly. But isn't it true that sometimes injuries of this nature are fatal regardless of medical intervention? Dr. Blake remained composed. Sometimes, yes. But not in this case. In this case, he could have lived. The lawyer's jaw tightened slightly before he nodded. No further questions. Judge Foster shifted in her seat. The witness may step down. Dr. Blake gathered her papers and left the stand, walking past Randall without so much as a glance in his direction. The judge turned toward the prosecution. Does the state rest its case? The prosecutor nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Foster then looked toward the defense. Counsel, does the defense have any additional witnesses to call? Randall's attorney hesitated for just a second too long before shaking his head. No, Your Honor. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge folded her hands in front of her. Very well. We will proceed to closing arguments tomorrow. Court is adjourned for the day. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. Emily exhaled slowly, her hand still gripping her lap. She turned her gaze toward Randall, who remained in his seat, staring blankly ahead. For the first time since this trial started, he looked like a man who knew he had already lost. The next morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. It was heavier, quieter, almost suffocating. The trial that had once seemed like just another legal proceeding had transformed into something else entirely. It wasn't just about Marcus Hall anymore. It wasn't just about whether Brian Randall had denied him medical care. It was about what that choice represented, about the long-standing abuse of power, about the lives that had been ruined because men like Randall believed they were untouchable. Emily sat in her usual seat, her fingers laced together as she watched the courtroom fill. There were more reporters now, more spectators, more people who wanted to see how this case would end. In the far corner of the room, she spotted Teresa Hall, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench. The pain in her face was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a trial to her. This was the closest thing to justice she would ever get for her son. A sharp voice cut through the murmurs. All rise. The courtroom stood as Judge Foster entered, her presence commanding immediate silence. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and glanced down at the documents in front of her. We are here today for closing arguments. Prosecution, you may proceed. The lead prosecutor, a tall man with graying hair, stood and buttoned his suit jacket before stepping forward. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he wanted to ensure that every word he spoke carried weight. He turned toward the jury, letting his gaze sweep over them before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the evidence presented in this case. You have listened to the testimony of medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and eyewitnesses. You have seen the security footage, heard the emergency dispatch recordings, and read the autopsy report. And through all of it, one undeniable truth remains: Officer Brian Randall had a choice that night. A choice that cost a man his life. A ripple of tension ran through the room. Randall sat motionless at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes locked forward. The prosecutor continued, his voice even but firm. We do not expect law enforcement officers to be perfect. We understand that their jobs are difficult, that they are required to make split-second decisions. But what happened on June 14th was not the result of a difficult decision. It was not the product of confusion or fear. It was the result of negligence, of arrogance, of a belief that Marcus Hall's life did not matter enough to warrant help. Emily swallowed hard, feeling her pulse quicken. The prosecutor took a step closer to the jury. Officer Randall did not hesitate to detain Marcus Hall. He did not hesitate to use force. But when it came to providing medical aid, when it came to recognizing that the man before him was in distress, he chose to do nothing. And then, when a trained paramedic arrived, when Emily Carter was ready and willing to do her job, he chose to stop her. He let the words hang in the air. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate abuse of authority, and Marcus Hall paid the ultimate price for it. The prosecutor turned slightly, glancing toward Teresa Hall. Her eyes were wet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, but she did not look away. Marcus Hall was a son, a friend, a human being, the prosecutor said. And his life mattered. A few quiet sniffles could be heard in the courtroom, but no one spoke. The prosecutor straightened his posture. The prosecution asks that you find Officer Brian Randall guilty as charged. We ask that you hold him accountable for his actions, just as any other person would be held accountable if they had made the same choices. He gave a final nod and stepped back toward his seat. Judge Foster turned her attention to the defense. Counsel, you may proceed. Randall's attorney stood, his expression unreadable. He took a slow breath before walking toward the jury, his hands clasped behind his back. Ladies and gentlemen, my client has dedicated his career to serving this city. He has worked tirelessly to protect its citizens, to maintain order, to ensure that justice is upheld. Emily felt a wave of anger rise in her chest. The defense attorney continued. Was Marcus Hall's death tragic? Absolutely. No one here denies that. But what we must ask ourselves is whether Officer Randall's actions on that night were criminal or simply a misunderstanding. Randall sat a little straighter in his chair. My client did not act out of malice, the lawyer said. He made a call based on his experience. He believed, in that moment, that Mr. Hall was not in immediate danger. Was he wrong? Perhaps. But being wrong is not the same as being guilty. The lawyer turned slightly, gesturing toward the jury. We ask that you consider the pressures law enforcement officers face, the quick decisions they must make. And we ask that you do not condemn a man who has spent his life serving this community based on a single moment of misjudgment. He nodded once and returned to his seat. Judge Foster let a moment of silence pass before speaking. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will now deliberate. Court is adjourned until a verdict is reached. She struck the gavel, and the tension in the room finally cracked as people began murmuring, standing, stretching after hours of stillness. Emily remained seated, her fingers curled into her palms. The wait had begun. She glanced toward Randall. For the first time since this trial started, he wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone. The jury had been deliberating for hours. The courtroom was empty now, except for a few lingering reporters outside the doors and the quiet murmur of attorneys discussing the possible outcomes. Emily sat alone on one of the wooden benches, her hands clasped together, her nails digging into her skin as she tried to steady her breathing. Across the room, Teresa Hall sat still, her eyes locked on the empty judge's bench. She hadn't spoken much since the trial began, but her presence alone had been enough to remind everyone why they were here. She wasn't just waiting for a verdict, she was waiting to see if her son's life would finally mean something in the eyes of the law. Brian Randall was in a holding room somewhere, waiting just like they were. He hadn't looked at her since the closing arguments, and for the first time, she didn't feel anger toward him. She didn't feel hate. She felt nothing. Because no matter what the jury decided, nothing would bring Marcus Hall back. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the bailiff stepped inside, his voice breaking the tense silence. The jury has reached a verdict. Emily inhaled sharply, standing on shaky legs as she followed the slow procession of people filing back into the courtroom. The air felt heavier than before, every movement laced with anticipation. The seats filled quickly, reporters adjusting their cameras, attorneys taking their places, and finally, the judge stepping back into the room with her usual quiet authority. All rise. Everyone stood. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson, an older woman with silver hair and tired eyes, clutched a folded piece of paper in her hands. She didn't look at Randall. She didn't look at anyone. She just held the weight of justice between her fingers, her expression grim. Judge Foster took her seat and nodded toward the jury box. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, unfolding the paper with careful precision. Yes, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick and unmoving. Emily barely breathed. In the case of the state of California versus Brian Randall, on the charge of second-degree manslaughter, we, the jury, find the defendant. A pause. A single heartbeat of silence. Guilty. The words hit the room like a shockwave. There was no explosion of noise, no dramatic outburst, just a collective exhale, a shift in energy that left Randall frozen in place. His lawyer tensed beside him, whispering something urgently, but Randall didn't respond. He blinked once. Twice. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. The judge's gavel struck the wood. Order. The murmurs in the courtroom settled. Judge Foster looked at Randall, her expression unreadable. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. The defendant is remanded into custody. The bailiff moved toward Randall, reaching for the handcuffs, but Randall finally reacted, jerking his arm back as if he couldn't believe what was happening. You can't be serious, he muttered. His voice was quiet at first, then louder. This is a joke, right? No one responded. This is insane, he snapped, twisting toward his attorney, but his lawyer remained silent, his lips pressed into a thin line. The bailiff grabbed Randall's wrist, snapping the cuffs around them. The sound of metal clicking into place was the only noise in the courtroom. Randall turned, his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for something, support, outrage, a sign that this wasn't real. He found nothing. He turned toward Emily. For the first time, his gaze wasn't mocking. It wasn't filled with arrogance. It wasn't even angry. It was just hollow. She met his eyes, her face unreadable. You did this, he whispered. Emily tilted her head slightly. No, she said softly. You did. The bailiff pulled Randall toward the exit. He struggled for a second, but it was useless. As he was led away, the reporters scrambled to document every movement, cameras flashing, journalists whispering into microphones. Emily let out a slow breath, but there was no relief. Teresa Hall sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She had won, if you could call it that. But there was no celebration. Justice had been served. But her son was still gone. The gavel struck again. Court is adjourned. Emily turned away, stepping toward the doors, away from the flashing cameras, away from the reporters who wanted a statement, away from the weight of everything that had happened. The case was over. But the fight was just beginning. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of the verdict still hanging in the air like an unshakable presence. Reporters whispered into microphones outside the doors, relaying every detail to an audience waiting for the outcome. Spectators murmured among themselves, some satisfied with the ruling, others still stunned by the reality that a police officer had been convicted at all. Emily sat in the same seat she had occupied for the entire trial, her hands resting in her lap, her body tense even though the hardest part was over. Brian Randall was gone, led away in handcuffs, his usual arrogance replaced by a stunned silence. The courtroom that had once been filled with his laughter, his smirks, his dismissive attitude, now held only the echoes of his defeat. Across the room, Teresa Hall remained seated, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly together. She hadn't moved since the verdict was read, hadn't spoken a word since the judge struck the gavel for the final time. Emily wasn't sure if she was in shock or simply exhausted. Slowly, she rose to her feet and approached the grieving mother. "Mrs. Hall," she said softly. Teresa blinked, as if only now realizing she was still in the courtroom. Her eyes, filled with sorrow that no verdict could ever erase, finally lifted to meet Emily's. "It's over," Emily said, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Teresa let out a breath, one that sounded as if it had been trapped inside her for years. "I thought I would feel something," she admitted. "Closure. Relief. But I don't." Emily nodded, understanding. "Because no matter what happened today, Marcus is still gone." Teresa looked down at her hands. "I spent this entire trial waiting for justice. And now that it's here, I realize it's not justice at all. Justice would be my son walking through that door. Justice would be him going home tonight." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "I know." Teresa finally stood, gripping the back of the chair as if steadying herself. "But at least now, the world knows what happened. And maybe the next time something like this happens, people will remember Marcus. Maybe it won't be so easy to ignore." Emily wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that Randall's conviction would mean something beyond this one case, that it would send a message, that it would prevent another mother from sitting in a courtroom, listening to people debate whether her child's life had value. But she also knew the system. She knew how easily things were swept under the rug, how quickly people forgot when the cameras stopped rolling. "We won't let them forget," Emily said. Teresa studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "No, we won't." The two women walked out of the courtroom together, stepping into the chaos of reporters and flashing lights. Microphones were thrust toward them, voices shouting questions, cameras desperate to capture their reactions. Emily didn't stop. Neither did Teresa. They pushed past the frenzy, out into the open air, where the weight of the trial no longer pressed down on them. But as they stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the reality of what came next settled in. "This isn't the end," Teresa said. "It's just the beginning." Emily looked out at the sea of faces, at the journalists waiting for a headline, at the protesters holding signs demanding change, at the officers standing guard, watching it all unfold. She took a deep breath. "We fight," she said. "We make sure this doesn't happen again." Teresa nodded, her grief still raw but her resolve stronger than ever. Emily knew the world wouldn't change overnight. She knew there would be more trials, more names, more battles ahead. But for now, they had won. And sometimes, that was enough to keep going. With one last look at the courthouse behind her, she stepped forward, ready for whatever came next. The ending of this story is not about victory in the traditional sense. Yes, Brian Randall is convicted. Yes, Emily Carter and Teresa Hall leave the courtroom knowing that, for once, accountability has been served. But justice, in its truest form, remains elusive. Marcus Hall is still gone. No verdict can bring him back, no punishment can undo the choices that led to his death. That's the cruel reality of cases like this. The best possible outcome still feels hollow because it comes too late. What makes this ending powerful is not just Randall's downfall, but the shift in those left standing. Emily, once just a witness, now understands the depth of the fight ahead. Teresa, a grieving mother, realizes that justice in the courtroom is only one battle in a much larger war. They both leave the courthouse not as people who have won, but as people who refuse to let this be the end. Randall, on the other hand, is a symbol of a system that allowed him to believe he was untouchable. His arrogance, his laughter, his complete disregard for the consequences of his actions, it was never about just him. It was about how many others like him exist, how many more names have been lost because people like him believed they had the power to decide who mattered and who didn't. His conviction doesn't fix the system, but it cracks its foundation. The real story begins after the trial. Will this case set a precedent, or will it fade into just another headline? Will it spark change, or will the cycle repeat? That uncertainty is what makes this ending both realistic and frustrating. But there is hope, not in the verdict itself, but in what comes next. Because change isn't about a single court case. It's about the people who refuse to stop fighting, the ones who take their grief and turn it into something that cannot be ignored. Emily and Teresa are those people. And that's why this story doesn't end here.